All right, let's dive right into this, because today we are looking at one of the most incredible, high-stakes standoffs in all of European history. Picture this. It's the year 1529. The mighty Ottoman Empire, led by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, has pushed further into Central Europe than literally ever before. They are standing right on the doorstep of the Habsburgs, at the gates of Vienna. And look, this wasn't just another battle. This was a massive clash of empires that was going to define the borders of the continent for centuries to come.
And honestly, that sets up the core mystery of our explainer today. You have to wonder, how in the world did a tiny, hastily thrown-together garrison manage to stop what was arguably the greatest, most terrifying army of the 16th century? The odds stacked against Vienna were absolutely staggering, and yet, somehow, the city survived. How did they actually pull that off?
Well, to figure that out, we're going to break this explainer down into 6 quick parts. We'll go from the setup of the conflict and the long Ottoman march, over to the walls of Vienna, the siege in the mines, the victory in the snow, and finally, the chronicles of the battle.
Okay, starting off with part 1, the setup of the conflict, or as I like to call it, the geopolitical chessboard.
So, to understand why Suleiman is suddenly at the gates of Vienna, we actually need to rewind 3 years to the Battle of Mohács in 1526. The Ottomans had just defeated King Louis II of Hungary, completely blowing the region wide open. The Habsburg Archduke, Ferdinand I, tried to claim the Hungarian throne, but the Ottomans backed a rival, a guy named John Zápolya. This basically turned Hungary into a massive, volatile buffer zone. Ferdinand desperately needed backup, but he was left totally out to dry. See, his brother was the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and Charles was completely distracted. Fighting the French, dealing with the rise of Protestantism, he had his hands full. Meanwhile, Suleiman the Magnificent had laser focus. He wanted to secure his new Hungarian lands and completely crush the Habsburg threat.
Which naturally brings us to part 2, the long Ottoman march, an absolute logistical nightmare.
Let's trace this journey. In May of 1529, Suleiman's massive army leaves Bulgaria. By August, they hit Osijek and link up with their Hungarian ally, Zápolya. September 8th, they capture Buda. And by late September, boom, they are at Vienna. But just reading those dates out loud totally hides the brutal reality, because this march was agonizing.
Believe it or not, nature was actually Vienna's very first defender. Torrential spring rains caused absolute massive flooding all across the Balkans. The roads literally turned to deep, thick mud. It got so bad that the Ottomans had to just abandon their heavy siege artillery. I'm talking about the massive cannons that could have easily pulverized Vienna's walls. And they lost an estimated 20,000 camels in the process. So by the time they even laid eyes on Vienna, the Ottoman army was exhausted, sick, and completely stripped of its heaviest, most destructive weapons. But inside the city, pure panic. That brings us to part 3, the walls of Vienna, and some incredibly desperate defenses.
Just picture this for a second. An estimated 150,000 men made up Suleiman's invading force. We're talking elite Janissary infantry, light and heavy cavalry, plus vassal troops from places like Moldavia and Serbia. It was a literal tidal wave of manpower heading straight for the Austrian capital. And in stark contrast, the Christian garrison left to defend the city, roughly 17,000 men. Yeah, 17,000 against 150,000. Because the emperor was distracted, these defenders were a totally mixed patchwork force. The core was made up of German Landsknecht mercenaries and this highly skilled elite unit of just 700 Spanish arquebusiers, musketeers from Castile, led by a commander named Luis de Avalos.
The guy pulling the strings for the defense was Niklas, Count of Salm. He was a 70-year-old veteran mercenary, and he was just ruthlessly efficient. He immediately walled up all 4 main city gates. Vienna's walls were 300 years old and barely 2 meters thick, basically paper against modern warfare. So he had citizens ripping up cobblestones and tearing down their own buildings to construct massive earthen barricades behind the walls to absorb cannonballs. And as a final brutal measure, he ordered the entire suburbs outside the city to be burned to the ground. Why? So the advancing Ottomans would have zero cover.
Okay, the stage is set. Moving on to part 4, the siege and the mines. Basically a terrifying underground war. Remember how the Ottomans lost their big cannons in the mud? Well, that meant they had to pivot. A huge chunk of their army were cavalrymen, the Sipahis, who are pretty much useless when you're just staring at a wall. So the battle went completely underground. Ottoman engineers started frantically digging tunnels to plant explosive mines right underneath Vienna. In response, the Christians started digging their own countermines. It was wild. On October 6th, the defenders actually launched a massive counterattack, a sally of 8,000 men charging outside the walls to disrupt the diggers. They managed to blow up several Ottoman mines, but man, the retreat back to the city was pure chaos and they took terrible losses. Just brutal close-quarters combat in the dirt.
The clock was ticking for everyone. The defenders were bleeding out, but out in the camps, the Ottomans were starving, freezing, and facing mutiny. Here's part 5, the victory in the snow, a truly miraculous climax.
On October 12, Suleiman holds a council of war. He throws massive financial incentives at his elite janissaries, basically begging them for one last desperate push. And on October 14th, boom, Ottoman mines successfully blow a colossal 30-meter wide hole right near Vienna's main gate. Thousands of troops swarm the gap. But wait, standing right there in the smoking rubble are those German pikemen and Spanish arquebusiers. Firing point blank and holding an absolute wall of long pikes, the defenders pushed back wave after wave. The Ottomans took thousands of casualties and were finally forced to fall back.
And then, get this, that exact same night, something absolutely unbelievable happened. Unseasonal, heavy snowfall completely blanketed the battlefield. For an army that was already battling disease and out of supplies, freezing snow was the absolute last straw. Suleiman had to call it. He ordered a retreat. It turned into a total disaster. The Ottomans lost insane amounts of baggage and smaller artillery to the snow and Austrian hit-and-run attacks along the way. Inside Vienna, those exhausted, battered defenders looked at that October snow as straight-up divine intervention.
With the city somehow saved, we hit our final section, Part 6, the Chronicles of the Battle. How exactly did everyone record and remember this whole thing?
Look, political spin is definitely not a modern invention. In a letter he sent to Venice right after the retreat, Suleiman wrote, "I have conquered the kingdom of Hungary and given its crown to Zápolya." Notice anything missing? Yeah, he completely downplayed the failure at Vienna. He framed the whole campaign as just a targeted, super successful mission to secure Hungary for his guy. In his official records, it wasn't a defeat at all. It was just checking a box.
And the Ottoman historians definitely carried that water. The chronicler Ibrahim Pechevi didn't frame the retreat as a military failure either. He called it Allah's will. The prevailing idea was, hey, the timing just wasn't right. They saw it as a mere prelude to future holy wars where they would definitely face down Charles V. It was basically spun as a delayed victory.
But over in Europe, oh man, they hype this up big time, sometimes with a little creative exaggeration. The Venetian diaries of Marian Sanudo pumped the Ottoman troop numbers up to over 300,000, just to make the Christian defense look even more superhuman. Over in Spain, these popular verses called coplas were being printed and sung everywhere, immortalizing the incredible bravery of those 700 Castilian musketeers, only 250 of whom actually survived. They even honored that tough 70-year-old commander, Niklas of Salm. Sadly, he died shortly after from wounds he took during that final breach, but his grand sarcophagus still sits in Vienna today, a monument to an impossible stand. Which brings us to a massive historical what-if to close us out. We just saw how the spring mud literally stripped the Ottomans of their cannons, and how the autumn snow completely broke their final siege. So I'm going to leave you with this to chew on. How totally different would European history look right now if the weather had just been a few degrees warmer? What if it simply hadn't snowed in October 1529? It is a wild thought, and it really shows you how completely fragile history can be. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.